While virtue theory is appealing, there are, of course, problems with it. Otherwise, I would simply say virtue theory, correct ethics, and we're done. So, here are some of the standard problems with virtue theory, kind of stock objections. The first problem is specifying the virtues. Virtue theorists, the criticism goes, tend to be rather vague about the virtues. It's also contended that they tend not to justify the acceptance of virtues, and the argument would be that being vague about the virtues, not justifying the virtues, therefore there'd be no reason to accept virtue theory. So how can virtue theorists reply to this objection? Well, a common reply is that almost everyone intuitively accepts that the virtues are in fact virtues. And this, of course, is an appeal to intuition. And this is interpreted, perhaps incorrectly, as indicating that the virtues described objectively desirable qualities. Therefore, one might conclude there is no special need to provide such a justification, since the burden of proof would be on the people who claim that these virtues are not justified. Also, virtue theorists do provide, at least some of them, provide arguments for accepting the virtues. So this objection, as one would expect, is not decisive. Second problem could be called the problem of self-focus, that virtue ethics seems, well, perhaps selfish, because the emphasis would generally appear to be on developing one's own virtues. And this, the objection goes, sort of ironically, would make virtue theory a selfish theory. So how do virtue theorists reply? Well, one common reply is that many of the virtues do involve other people, such as generosity is aimed at others, kindness is aimed at others, loyalty is aimed at others, and selfishness is, of course, regarded as being a vice rather than a virtue. And thinkers such as Aristotle and Confucius explicitly developed their virtue theory in the context of society, that the virtues are not just about oneself. One develops one's virtues to be a better part of society, which would not seem to be particularly selfish. The third objection is totalitarianism. Now, totalitarianism is essentially a political system under which there is total control, hence totalitarianism, of people's lives by the state. The government, roughly put, controls and rules everything. Now, this obviously need not be like, perfectly ruling every single aspect with zero left over. But the general idea is that totalitarian states have far more control than is seen as being acceptable and being rather extreme. So here's how the objection typically goes. So virtue theorists generally focus on developing particular virtues. We looked at Confucius, and he had a set of virtues. He said, these are the ones to develop. And Aristotle also focused in on particular virtues. And so it could be contended that virtue theorists would be aimed at creating a uniform society with no diversity, that everyone would have the same virtues. Now, more tellingly, when we look at Aristotle, and we'll look at him in more detail when we talk about his view of moral education, he directly and explicitly argues that the state should forcibly impose moral education on the citizens. And so he's quite explicit about the state essentially taking, really extreme control over people's behavior and ethics. So the problem would be, if we regard diversity as a moral good, and virtue theorists are seen as imposing this uniformity on people, this would be seen as morally wrong. And again, in reality and in fictional cases, totalitarian states generally try to make everyone the same. Now, there's also the fact that diversity, whether one believes it's good or not, seems to be a fact. People are different. And so part of the argument is that trying to make a population virtuous would require using force, perhaps, against those who do not match the intended model of virtue. And once again, this is especially effective against Aristotle because he does very explicitly, as we'll see when we talk about moral education, argue that the state should control pretty much all aspects of life. So he's saying, yes, embracing a form of totalitarianism. So how can virtue theorists reply to this? Well, one reply is to deny the totalitarianism. So it can be argued by the virtue theorist that developing one's virtues would be no more likely to lead necessarily to uniformity and conformity than encouraging people to fully develop their athletic ability or artistic ability would do so. So imagine, kind of a silly example, imagine the state was encouraging people to become more athletic or more artistic. Well, people could become more athletic in a huge range of ways. They could go for strength training, endurance training, agility training, different sports, different activities. And so there's no reason that the state would have to just simply say you can only do one athletic thing. Now, true, if the state was just simply saying you must do this one thing and nothing else, and everyone must be the same, then there'd be a case for that. But there's no necessary requirement that developing virtues would require that everyone be exactly alike. Also, if we see totalitarianism as a bad thing, as full of vice, then it would be contrary to virtue theory. And the development of virtue does seem consistent with diversity. There's no requirement that we see that everyone must be exactly the same in exactly the same way. Now, another approach would be to do what's called in philosophy biting the bullet. That's when there's something that appears bad, but a philosopher, simply accepts it and says, yes, this is how it is. This is acceptable. So a philosopher could say, yes, if you have virtue theory, imposed by the state, and it's making people good, you could call this totalitarianism, but they could argue that this would be a good thing. If you had a state that was in fact truly good, and it was, educating people to be good and compelling them to be good, for real, not like a fictional or real dystopian state, which is simply pretending to be good and is actually corrupt and terrible. But imagine a state that is in fact morally good, and they're attempting to make the citizens morally good and correct the evil citizens, the bad citizens. One could say, well, what's wrong with that? Would we prefer to have a state that has lots of evil people and we just let evil people be evil, or simply lock them in jail or kill them rather than correcting them? And one can make that case. Now, of course, one could counter with a practical kind of argument that we will never, in fact, have, truly good rulers, and this will all just be a cover for doing terrible things, which would be, a very practical reply. So there are ways, of course, to raise these objections and reply to them. Another standard objection is the objection of conflicting virtues. And the problem is this: virtues often come in conflict with each other. So what one virtue sort of says we should do, if we're acting virtuous, may run afoul of another equally good virtue. For example, imagine a case where a person, if they tell the truth about what their friend has done, that would harm their friend. And so we have a conflict here. Honesty is a virtue, and honesty would, the virtue of honesty would push us to tell the truth, even about, our friends. But of course, the virtue of loyalty would tell us not to harm our friends. And so we could very well have a conflict like that, where honesty conflicts with loyalty. And it's easy to imagine many other such conflicts. And so the criticism is that because there are these conflicts between virtues, virtue theory cannot handle these conflicts, so that's a defect. So the virtue theorists, of course, have a reply, because just as I didn't say virtue theory is the one true view, solves all problems, I didn't say virtue theory has been completely defeated. and is not worth considering. So virtue theorists have pretty easy replies to this. The first one is the reasonable approach that what is a problem for everyone is not a particular problem for anyone. So the idea of this concept is that if you have, a certain options to pick from, and they all suffer from a particular defect, that defect doesn't give you grounds to pick one over the other, because they all have that problem. To use one not involving a moral theory, suppose you're picking between two political candidates, and they both committed adultery, and you know that, and you think adultery is wrong. Well, in that case, you would regard them both as bad, but it gives you no reason to pick one over the other because they're both bad in the same way. So yes, it's bad, but it gives you no grounds for picking one over the other. So in the case of moral theories, all moral theories seem to face that same problem, that there'll be conflicts between, whatever you use to assess moral values. And so the fact that you can have a conflict between honesty and loyalty is not like a unique special problem to virtue theory, because you could have a conflict, say, between rules. Like maybe there's a rule that you tell the truth and a rule that you're loyal to your friends. So then you'd have a conflict between those rules. Now, the obvious exception would be, of course, absolutist ethics. So if you're a moral absolutist, your theory would allow no conflicts because there would always be one definitive answer to every moral conflict. But any non-absolutist theory would have this problem. Now, the virtue theorist has another approach, which is they can, rather than just simply saying, hey, everyone's got this problem, they can also say this can be resolved, because in the case of virtues, it's not the case that every virtue is equal and identical in every situation in terms of its value. So one could assess which virtue takes precedent, which should be more virtuous, which should be more viceful. And, Aristotle, for example, has ways of assessing, the quality of virtues. So, for example, if the virtue of honesty conflicts with the virtue of loyalty, one would look at which one should be the one that is decisive here, which one should be emphasized. So, for example, if you have a case where if you tell the truth about your friend, they will be, say, horribly murdered for doing nothing wrong, then easy. Yeah. Loyalty outweighs, honesty. If it's a case where your friend has done terrible, terrible things and they're going to go murder someone, then you might say that truth would outweigh loyalty here. And again, this can all be debated. And virtue theorists have, it's not like they're not aware of this problem. They have attempted to address it. The next problem is the problem of guides. And this criticism is that virtue theory doesn't give us adequate guidelines for action. So being told to act in a virtuous way does not tell us how to act in particular situations. So, for example, knowing that bravery is a virtue wouldn't tell you how to act, say, in battle or during like a mugging, for example. To further illustrate this, as when we talk about virtue theory, they're always pushing, the mean between two extremes, and they say not too much, not too little, but just enough. And a critic could say, well, that's kind of like asking how much food you should put on someone's plate, like when you're serving at like a party or an event. And the answer is always, of course, enough. That's the easy and correct answer. But what does that exactly mean? Because enough is, pretty vague. And so the criticism is virtue theory just doesn't really give us the particulars we need to make moral decisions. Now, already built into virtue theory is a reply to this. Aristotle kind of explicitly goes through this matter, and he asserts that there is no need to provide such specific guidelines, because in developing virtue, a person will learn how to act. And to use an obvious analogy, when you learn to drive, you don't get a guidebook that says exactly what to do in every single situation. It doesn't say, for example, if you're turning left onto Tennessee Street and a green Volkswagen Beetle attempts to cut you off, use the following, 7 techniques to avoid, an accident. It's, you learn general skills about driving, and then hopefully you can apply them correctly in particular situations. Also, one could contend that this objection seems to assume that morality requires definite guides, such as rules, etc., and it could be contended that simply assuming we must have definitive guides could be seen as begging the question against virtue theory, assuming that it's simply wrong. The final kind of standard objection is the moral luck objection. And the objection is that virtue simply requires lots of luck. That, going with Aristotle, he was talking about how you fully develop your excellence and you, in the context of a society, and it's over time, and then you become, virtuous and happy. And so the ethical life would seem to require being healthy, able enough to engage in all these virtuous activities, live long enough to develop your virtues, and have a society that is healthy and good enough to allow you to develop virtue. So you're not in, again, some sort of terrible society which makes it difficult, presumably impossible, to be virtuous. Now, all that stuff, where you're born, your genetics, your lifespan, etc., doesn't seem to be within largely, out of our control. So you don't get to pick your genetic code. You don't get to pick your society initially. You might be able to move or change it, but it would seem that being good is not under your control. And the objection is that the ability to be good should be under your control. And so being able to solve moral problems correctly, under virtue theory, requires good character. But if good character is simply a matter of luck, you're just born with the right qualities, in the right place, in the right society, and you live long enough to develop your virtues, that seems to be all luck. So moral, problem solving is just luck. So how can the virtue theorists reply to this? Well, one reply is to do kind of a sports response, that although luck is a factor, luck will balance out. And one could also reply that even under great adversity, even if a person gets born, unlucky, so to speak, in bad circumstances, they could develop their virtue even under that, adversity. It'd be more difficult, of course. And Confucius and Aristotle especially do note that being virtuous can be very, very difficult. They didn't say it was, super easy. And people can, even if their society is not that good, people can impact their society. And of course, one can also reply, well, if luck just kind of rules everything, then pretty much all moral theories that involve, agency on the part of the person would just be, impossible, because if all your qualities and decision-making depends entirely on luck, then pretty much every moral theory that isn't just based on luck would just fall apart. Now, that one could take that view that morality is just luck and that's the correct moral theory, but this would, doom the whole intuitive concept of moral agency and people having, any agency at all. It would all just be luck for everything. So those are some of the standard objections against virtue theory and some standard replies. And as would be expected, virtue theory is neither obviously true and undefeatable, nor totally defeated. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.